All right. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Grace at the Table. We are so happy to have you join us for our next installment in our panel discussion series on kingdom and culture, where we hope to take topics we encounter in our daily lives and current culture and interpret and analyze them through Scripture in light of God's kingdom. We hope that you'll join us by interacting on today's topic of politics by texting in your comments and questions live for us to interact with. The text number is 443-499-2611 and should be on your screen if you need to reference it later. All questions are pushed through to us anonymously, so feel free to ask any question, no matter how crazy or embarrassing it may seem, because we will never know it was you. We really want these times to be as interactive and helpful as possible for those watching, so please send in any questions you might have for us to add to our discussion. Today, we're joined by three panelists, Brendan, Eric, and Don, who are all pastors here at Grace, and we are very excited to dig into this new topic with you guys. So thanks for joining us.
Woohoo. You know,
All
they
right.
say don't talk about religion and politics. Here we go. Let's do both.
Digging right in. So, with no delay, let's start with our first question. What can we encourage about Christians engaging in politics?
So we all look at each other like.
As you dig in. Yeah, let's hear it.
I think that here's how we should think about politics and just engagement and what politics is. Politics is an arena in which, as Christians, we can love our neighbor. That's what it is. It's one way. It's not the only way. It's not the most important way. It's a very small way, but if that's the motivating, guiding factor of how do I love my neighbor and look out for my neighbor's good. You know, in a democratic system like ours, we can have a voice and make things happen in the small part that we can play, and so we're working for other people's good.
Other thoughts?
Well, you think about the reality of the storyline of the Bible. Jesus set apart a holy nation at that time, and so throughout the Old Testament, obviously it's a little bit different now with New Testament, Old Testament, but there was a reality of the way God wanted to think about a nation, a people, and they wanted to engage with the cultures around them as well. And so obviously one of the main ways people do that is through things like politics and be able to think about how they shape their nation. And so we have the opportunity to engage in that. It's not shunned, it's not something that's pushed aside, but something that's encouraged to say, hey, the way you live your life, including things like the way you run your country, should be reflective of your beliefs and your God.
Thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I don't want to kind of reiterate kind of just what I covered last week.
Just refer to last week's message.
But clearly, I think, our national identity is a legitimate part of who we are. We are citizens of this country, and we should care about that. And as I said last week, we can certainly affirm that we should love our country. We should want the best for our country. We should want our leaders to make good, wise, and in our case, godly decisions wherever possible. So we're called to play a part in that process in our being a citizen of this country. And so we should engage in the political process in whatever ways. Some people may feel more called to do that than others in different ways, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And I think it really is one of our responsibilities as a Christian to be a good citizen.
You think about verses in the Old Testament, like seek the welfare of the nation. That was a time when they were in exile in a nation that wasn't even their own, and yet they still were to seek the welfare, the good of the nation.
Yeah. All right, so obviously not in and of itself a bad thing. So now we need to look briefly at where does a good thing go bad? Because that's obviously the question here. So we talked briefly, and again, referencing your message without going back through the whole thing, you mentioned a couple pitfalls in that particular one. Are there other pitfalls that we would want to touch on of where something like this can be so good and then where it starts to turn into something that's not so good?
Yeah, I think the verse that you just referenced, that's Jeremiah 29, I think something, maybe 7, and it's Jeremiah's letter to the Jewish exiles living in Babylon, and they're like, what do we do? Is God going to rescue us from here? And his instructions to them is like, basically, settle down, live out your lives, represent me in my heart, and he says, and seek the welfare of the city which I've sent you into exile. And I think So what he says to the exiles in Babylon is, I think, a really good identity for us to do politics out of, because First Peter says that we're strangers and exiles here, that, you know, while part of our identity is, yeah, we're Americans or whatever, that our citizenship is in heaven. And so if we're to do politics as an exile, politics as an outsider, politics if I want to seek the welfare of the city into which God has sent me to exile, if that's Maryland or America or whatever, where it goes wrong, I think where it starts to go wrong right off the bat is if I lose that exile mentality. And I'm like, this is...
So this is my home.
This is my home, and like that right off the bat raises the stakes. That we lose sight of an eternal and kingdom perspective, and so the stakes get raised. It becomes an existential battle. I've got to, fighting for the soul of my country to win back my country, and like we've gone wrong there because I'm an exile here, and so God has placed me here for the good of America, but this is not my home.
Okay. Can I pause you there for a second? Because I just want to make sure, sometimes I wonder if people know what it's like to have kingdom mentality for something like this. So when you say this is not your home, I'm just hearing some people out there going, well, it's very hard to at times latch on to a home that you have not been to, that you have not experienced, that you don't get to be a part of right now, and you can't even fully reference it apart from what we know about Christ and in Scripture about the kingdom that is to come and what God intends. So for an area like this, how would someone best grasp a kingdom mindset? What does that look like when you're thinking about another home? Because there's a lot of, descriptions of what that kingdom looks like. So compare and contrast for me a little bit here. Give me the focus of what we're talking about when we look at it for this.
Three things come to mind.
Okay.
One is an eternal perspective versus the temporary daily squabbles and everything. I go on Twitter. I'm like, what are we mad about today?
Okay.
But
so that's more this is not your home. We have forever.
Yeah.
Not the temporary.
And then along with that eternal perspective comes eternal priorities.
Okay.
That nations rise and fall, kingdoms come and go, but the Church of Jesus Christ and all whom Jesus ransoms out of every tribe and nation, language, and people will endure forever. And so the most important mission that I'm on here on planet Earth is to see that gospel, that salvation go forward. That's an eternal priority. But then the third thing is that while like having a kingdom mindset is that kind of eternal and heaven and new creation, at the same time, that new creation is coming true in the church. That's our identity as the people of God. That we're an outpost of God's kingdom, and so that means that that my first priority as I think about representing Jesus is how to represent Jesus as the people of God. The people of God living in exile, but it's more about how can the church be the church and not how can the world act more like the church, because we're the kingdom.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I think so, yes. I'm just trying to decide if I think there's
picking
any
up what I'm
questions
laying
I should pick through in there. So really, in a nutshell, if I'm going to sum that up, it's about living more broadly than for your temporal existence in your life, your experience, what you see, what you think, what you know, and thinking more about who God is in light of, of all of those things, and applying that where there's an eternity out there, and that's what we're made for. And, there is... all of this is for now. There will be nations that come and go and everything, and we're a part of that now, but there is a bigger picture at work that's really what we're in existence for. Yeah, and that's what you want us to focus on.
And that bigger picture is in the here and now being worked out in the life of the local church.
Okay, and that allows one to step away from some of the tensions.
It just brings it down a peg.
Where it feels so important.
Yeah.
Is that, okay, all right, so we're talking about the same thing. All right. Other pitfalls before we move on from that, because we started here with where it kind of goes bad, and that's why we ended up on the kingdom. Other things that people want to comment on pitfalls and
yeah, I think to me it's all about keeping, kind of going off what you're saying, it's keeping it in the right priority list. It's like, where does it fall in that priority list in terms of gospel versus other things. And it's the moments where we switch the priorities around and put our here and now political realities above things like church and gospel where we tend to go wrong. Obviously, it's very broad. We'll get into more of that, what that looks like.
Yeah.
But that's kind of the big picture in my mind. It's like when we're switching those priorities around and elevating it above where it really should be.
Gotcha. Thoughts from you, or no? You don't have to if you don't.
No, I mean,
Refer to last week's message.
I feel like I just kind of are reiterating things I said last week, but I think when I think about it, we have many legitimate identities, roles in the life we live. I think I said last week we're husbands, we're fathers, we're wives, we're mothers, we're employees, we're citizens, and they all have a legitimate place. And there's a legitimate role that we play in those kind of identity roles. But our identity as a believer, our Christian identity, being ransomed out of this world into the kingdom of God, is to be the center of all that.
It's not that it
And-
removes that one, it's that it redefines
It
how all of those are
redefines
played.
how all of those things relate to who we are.
Okay.
And if we keep those things in that proper balance, then, go out and be the citizen that God wants you to be and engage in politics and social causes and, representing that kingdom, reality of who you are with all the power that you want. Just don't let it become the center. Because when it becomes the center and things start revolving around it and your Christian identity gets pushed to the peripheral, that's when things begin to break down.
Because whatever's at the center is what's going to define how you operate around the other things.
Right. And it will, whatever is at the center will determine how you relate to other things in your life.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the analogy you used last week, the solar system, was a great picture of
Yes.
that. Of like when you try and take the solar system and remove the what needs to be the center of the sun and try and put a planet in the middle, it falls apart in how it exists. And as a Christian, if God's not the center of that, it falls apart, and we try and put other things in that center.
Yeah, and the way you can tell if it's falling apart is how what's the fruit being produced in it in your life. Is it a gracious humility and love and all the gospel fruit, the fruit of the Spirit and how we relate to this area, or are we seeing different kinds of things there?
Yeah, and that's exactly where we're headed with our next question. So
Yeah.
thank
Stole
you for
the
the
next
lead-in.
question.
I know, just sliding right in there. So what are some of the signs that we can look for in our own lives? Because this is not a question designed to help you evaluate somebody else's behavior. I'm going to be very clear on that.
Right there.
This is supposed to help you look at yourself. So what are the signs that you can look at for yourself to see if your solar system is out of whack? So we're going to call it idolatry, because anything where God is not the center, idol, which I think we've discussed previously in another chat, so I'm not going to go back there. So how do we see signs in our own lives of idolatry around this area?
And I'll start simply just the fact of, when your attitude is affected by whether something goes well or something doesn't go well in that arena, whatever idolatry, that idol that is, that might be a sign that maybe you're holding a little too tightly to it.
Is it possible to be emotional towards something in a level of care that isn't idolatrous?
Yes, for sure.
So, because I know someone's going to make that argument because I can hear it in my own head. So if I'm responding, I go, oh, that's grieving, that's upsetting, that's not good, blah, blah, blah. So I'm feeling all of that. Does that mean that's a sign of an idol, or does that mean that I care? And how do I make a difference between healthily grieved by something that may not be a good thing to observe and is sad, versus this is too important. This is not, I'm out of whack here. So how do you tell the difference?
I think for me personally, I think I'd argue that the fact if I can grieve over that and I can care of something, and if that dictates my entire day, that grief, versus I can kind of step back and say, all right, yes, that is sad and grievous, but it's not the main thing, then I'm in a decent place. Versus if I'm, for example, one of the things I used to always do, what I loved to do, was when I walked around the college campus and think about the lost people on the campus, I could grieve for that. And that, I think, is a place where I can grieve because I know it's people that aren't following Jesus. And there's a healthy grief that I can hold on to through my day that I think is a good thing rather than place it around an idol. Does that help kind of illustrate that a little bit?
I believe so. Any other thoughts or comments on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question of like how to know, how to self-evaluate if your emotions are rising and falling out of proportion of something's like reality.
And this is particularly important, I think, because there is a range of empathetic to maybe more logical people on
Yeah.
the spectrum. And
Yeah,
not
so
that
I
you
don't think
can't be
there's
both.
not one
but,
right answer.
You know, I think some people lean maybe towards different, qualities in that arena than the other. And so if someone is far more empathetic and they are, I had a friend who was like, I'm constantly told I'm a bleeding heart. And she's like, but I'm empathetic. I care about what happens to other people. Does that mean that I'm out of proportion? Or does that mean that that's who God made me and I care more and that's a good thing? But even if that's so, what do I do with that, with issues like this, so that it's not something that's too important or that controls the way I move forward?
So maybe this might be a place where we need each other to have trusted people who know you, who can speak into your life, who you can open up, you can ask them, you'd be like, am I out of proportion here?
What a loaded thing to do that you propose, Brendan, to ask community their opinions of us around the issue of politics, you crazy man. No, continue. It's a good point.
Yeah, so I think if we're asking people to help us evaluate, because I think that's a really hard thing to self-evaluate. If am I too invested in this? Something that just comes with its own set of blinders. But then to how to ratchet down my emotional extremes if I find I'm doing that. I think that goes back to kind of what's the sun at the center? What is a kingdom mindset? What is an eternal perspective? And coming back to that, because it might be just as simple as the time I'm spending these. If I'm spending 3 hours a day on political Twitter and 15 minutes in my Bible, this is going to have more of an emotional impact on me than the sun at the center of the solar system, and I need to readjust my priorities.
Yeah, like any idols, I think time's a great one. I think about what are the first and last things your mind is going to in the morning and night? What are the things that one of the things an illustration I heard when I was back in high school was the things you're thinking about when you're showering and driving alone. Those are the things that come to mind when you're kind of not doing anything else and you're alone in your space. What are those things that come to mind in those times? And if maybe some of those things are good things, maybe some are bad things, but those are usually signs to me of what your mind's drawn to.
So those are the
by
spaces
nature.
your brain is running in.
Yeah.
Empty space, what's the circuit?
Yep.
Interesting.
So obviously this is way more than politics. This is
Yeah.
just kind of idolatry 101, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think the very nature of things that become idols is they sneak up on you. And they're rarely bad things. They're usually good things that as you invest yourself more and more into for whatever the reasons are, all of a sudden, maybe one day you wake up and you realize, wow, this has really become kind of really big in my life. And sometimes it's hard to even realize that. As an expert in idolatry, not because I know so much about it, but because I've experienced it so much in my own life.
An expert player.
I'm very aware of how subtle that kind of process can be, And I always remember kind of the quote by John Calvin who said the human heart is a factory of idols. So that's the nature of our heart, is always kind of drifting towards something to make it an idol rather than God. And we have to manage, we have to be alert to that reality. And so politics and the stuff going on in the world around us can just be one more of those kind of things. But I think the things that you guys have said, the things that would come to my mind would be how much time and energy I'm putting into it, how much I'm thinking about it and talking about it in my life, and what kind of response is it producing in me? Am I angry? Am I, resentful? Am I putting other people down? Am I demeaning those who think different? Those are the kinds of things I would look for that would raise flags that something's not right here, maybe.
Yeah, I think of James. Is it James 2? I think maybe. I need to print this verse out and put it on a Post-it note on my computers. The wisdom from above is first of all peaceable, gentle, open to reason. And so if I'm finding that the way that I engage in this is not peaceable and gentle and open to reason, I have lost my way.
So it's a simple question to maybe ask yourself in like a prayerful space. If I came before the Lord and said, I'm going to hand this over. And this could be whatever is in this arena that you've got going on, whatever. So I'm not going to be specific. I'm going to hand over the outcome or the doings of this to you, God, for you to deal with and me to trust you to lead me through this and hand this over to you, the outcome of it. If you struggle to do that, I would say that's probably a sure sign. If you feel like you're sliding it and then you want to pull it back from the foot of the cross really badly, then maybe, just maybe, that might be it. Would that be fair to say?
Well, I think one of the best ways to test your heart for something that's become an idol, and this could be anything, is to do a little fast. To do a fast for a month.
I'm going to counter-argument because I'm sure someone's going to say, these are important issues. I don't know that it's good or healthy for me to completely disregard them. So how do you healthily fast without like putting your head under a rock?
Well, first of all, I don't know that the country will rise and fall because we
I'm
take
not
a
saying
month
it will.
fast from being engaged.
I'm here to
But,
ask the tough questions, man. And I think this is a question that someone would say in response to that. So I just want to hear what you have to say.
But to me, that's a little revealing. If this is something that you can't step away from and take a little break from without it kind of pressing in on you that you got to do this, there's some clear questions there.
So
that
the
I
whole
think-
I gotta keep up, you would question that.
Yeah,
Okay.
I would.
And you know, with this, you know, sometimes it can be easy to ask these questions kind of sitting in chairs and, you know, talking about issues, but often I think one of the reasons that politics can be so heated and feel so existential is because it really is real important issues. And so sometimes those issues can hit more personally.
Yeah.
You know, like it's easy to say disengage from this issue, but if this political issue is pressing in on me and affecting my life directly, hard to disengage from that. And I think but even there, it becomes a test of faith of if this is something pressing in on me, okay, can I trust God enough to just fix my eyes on Jesus and walk through this for a season without it pulling me back in?
Is God big enough and good enough, whether the party or the person I want, or the agenda item I want is going my way or not?
Yeah. And even in this whole spectrum of like they rise and fall, all the nations, wouldn't you want to hang on to something that you know is going to stick around? It just sounds
Jesus
more
sticks
comforting,
around.
doesn't it? You know, because I'm like, if I hang my hat on the wrong thing here and I know it could crumble, that's very anxiety driving right there. And I don't know that that's really how we want to live, but I understand we keep pressing in to do that. So
Yeah, and I don't want to make it seem like this is not a real challenge and a struggle in our lives, because the things that are going on politically, governmentally, you know, all those kinds of things, they affect us.
yeah.
And I think as Christians, you know, we can kind of feel the shifts going on in our culture, and there's a drifting further away from some of the values that, you know, we would hold dear, and we can kind of feel those shifts, and we can kind of feel the effects of that, and we're concerned about our kids and what kind of world they're going to grow up in, and so these are legitimate issues that I think we wrestle with, and it's not easy to keep these things in a balance and kind of have a trust in God that is bigger than that, and not let that become really so central.
Yeah. No, I agree. All right, so the people have turned up today on the question front, so we're going to dip in there because I want to make sure we get to all of these. And I don't even know, I'm going to read because I don't want to reinterpret some of these questions for the way that they're phrased that people have chosen. I'm going to trust that you guys are going to address whatever you hear in here appropriately to what you want to say.
Personally responsible.
That's what I'm looking for, man. All right, so we're going to start with the first one. All right, I'm now reading. Last week, the term Christian nationalism was shared. The definition sounded like it came from biased mainstream media. From my personal research and experience, the term actually reflects Christians who love God first and want to fight to keep our country from a socialist and communist agenda. By doing so, Christians want God's agenda promoted. Why is that not okay?
Well, I guess I should probably answer that one since it's reference to
That's
the
your
message
message.
list.
I feel like that's aimed at you, so maybe so.
And so just a clarification, first of all, but I think in coming up with the definition that I used in that message, I really didn't go to any mainstream media sources at all, but I really tried to use sources from Christian leaders, pastors, people who have kind of written on this issue from a biblical perspective and try to draw out some of how they would see it and, their concerns in trying to analyze this. But the point that person raises is a good, it's a legitimate point because, and I think this is what I tried to do in that message. I tried to say there are some things we would affirm that are perfectly legitimate as a citizen that you care about, that you're active and you're engaged, involved in, and there's nothing wrong with wanting your country to be the kind of place that you would like it to be. Doesn't everybody, do that? So the dangers that I pointed out are kind of when this can become so important that it dominates, who we are as Christians first. And so that's kind of the distinction that I was trying to draw. So I would say to that person, it's not bad to want your country to be the kind of place you want to live in. But as Christians, we have a higher identity and a higher calling and purpose that is to supersede even that in how we relate to that and handle that.
And could I think one of the ways the question was posed, I'm going to kind of take this. And so if I'm misinterpreting what the person said, so I'm sorry. But I think even the phrase, isn't it bad? What was the end of it? Like,
Why is that not okay?
yeah, why is it not okay to want God's agenda for our nation? How do you define God's agenda? Because I think that, that to me would be a really revealing question. Because if the way that you define God's agenda is a certain economic system, I mean, believe me, I don't want to live in a communist country. I think that there's lots of bad things about socialism and communism, but let's be careful. God's agenda is that Jesus, his son, is glorified through the salvation of sinners. That's God's agenda. Lots of other good and right and true and helpful and wise things that we can figure out how to navigate that and represent him. But if we take those good and true and right things and we make that's God's agenda, careful.
And also,
And that is where a flag that maybe we're beginning to merge our national identity with our faith in a way that kind of combines them in a way that's not biblical.
well, let me ask one clarifying point, because I think some people feel that they are trying, and I don't know that that's for this question, so I'm separating this a little bit, but some people feel that they are trying to further God's kingdom here on earth. Is that fully possible? Is that a fully biblical concept to do that, where the realities and the goodness of his future kingdom that he has for us is going to take place here, where we can create that here? Is there a range of which we can or can't do that? Or are we fighting for something that's never going to happen? Or is this something that we are called to do and somehow still recognize that maybe we're not really fully going to get there here? Do you understand the question?
So again, I'm not sure if that's what,
Yeah,
that's
again,
what
I don't
talking
know if
about.
that's what they mean, but in
your
case
question,
it is, I'm bringing that up.
But your question, I think that's why it's really important to understand the identity of God's kingdom in this age is the church. And so the furtherance of God's kingdom in this world is the advance of the gospel. It's not the world being conformed to certain moral standards, even if those are good. Even if as exiles in this land, we want the good. I want good for my neighbor, and so things like a biblical sexual ethic and the sanctity of life and justice and righteousness, those are good for my neighbor. I want those things for my neighbor, even if they don't want them, and so I'm going to vote for them. But that's not the same thing as the advancement of the kingdom. That's some of the ripple effect that the kingdom can have in any culture that God plants it in as exiles. But the kingdom itself, so those are the ripples. The pebble is the church.
So you're saying, in some sense, God's kingdom is being brought about regardless of the circumstances that we observe around us,
Yeah.
and that will not be stopped. But what that looks like to us in defining that in our environment here on this world, that is something we can misconstrue and think that the kingdom is not being furthered because this is happening around us or this is happening within people, and that's not the same thing.
Yeah, so to kind of further my metaphor here, if the kingdom of God is the pebble and the splash of the cultural and societal and political effects, praise God for the splashes. I'm going to splash. That's part of my job as a citizen. I want to splash. I want the adorning of the gospel in my life to have a ripple effect. But that is so very different than the advancement of the kingdom is more and more people in that pebble.
Well, and to go back to your question of is it possible to seek the good and actually be like a God's kingdom type of thing arriving here?
Yeah.
I mean, let's take a quick survey of church history and biblical history. I mean, the church has never had one central location. It's never had one national identity. It's throughout time has morphed across different centralities across the world. Even in the Old Testament, where God was with his people, they didn't do it well. You look at books like Judges and things like that. We want to try.
We ain't getting there, are we?
Yeah,
if
we
we're
want to try and do it well, but human history would say we don't.
Yeah.
We're always prone to falter in different areas.
Every time we start trying to bring the kingdom through political means, we end up with the Crusades.
Yeah, it's have a good track record.
Yeah, I think the reality is, as you guys have been saying, the kingdom does not rely on political or worldly structures or power. That what's going on in this age from the time Jesus ascended to heaven and sent out the disciples and us accordingly, in line with that. And that's what Jesus said. He said, as the Father sent me, I am sending you. What's going on in this age is God is gathering his people, his kingdom people, and he will continue to do that until that task is complete. And the way that is done is through the proclamation of the gospel, and the Spirit works through that to draw people to God and bring them into the kingdom. That's the way the kingdom goes forth. And so the church has been ordained as the only institution, if you will, that is responsible for the kingdom business. And so we proclaim the gospel, and then as people respond to that, we help equip and train and disciple them to be the people of God that represent him in this world. That's what's going on in this age. That's the kingdom business. That's what we as the church and as Christians have been sent into this world to do. No other mission can eclipse that, and we stay true to who we are in our identity as Christians.
Yeah, and like you said, so and part of that is like you said, is equipping people to go out and live lives that represent, including in the political sphere, including as God might ordain. I think one of the things that's on my heart is a concern I have in our day and age where politics is just a raging dumpster fire all around every side. Is that I think we need to be very wise in how we engage that, because there's a way in which we can do politics as a ripple effect of the gospel, but there's also a way we can do politics that is actually an impediment to the gospel. And if God's agenda is the salvation of sinners, woe to me if I'm doing things that are getting in the way of that. It's like we can put up good things and care about good causes, but do that in a way that's detracting from the main mission. And so I want to figure out, I don't know how to do this, figure out how can we do those things in a way that furthers the mission of saving sinners.
But still asking that question with the sun at the center of the solar system. So unwilling to compromise the sun being at the center, but still asking that question.
Well, and one of the challenges to my heart always is, I love our country. I think there's so many good things here. And one of the challenging things in my heart, the concept to think about is the fact that you think about God's agenda going forward. How many times do true believers and true advancement of the gospel happen even better in places that the gospel's not welcome?
Yeah, God's agenda is going forward just fine in communist China.
This is true. May not be cushy for the people all the time, but the agenda is not stopped.
Again, it's okay to say, I don't want my country to be like that. That's good. But God's agenda, Jesus is on the throne. He's not troubled by that.
Okay.
Yeah, I was really struck as I thought about this issue by kind of when Jesus was before Pilate, and Pilate says, are you a king? And Jesus says, yeah, but my kingdom is not of this world. He said, because if it was, my followers would be fighting for me. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this world. And I think the kingdom goes forth regardless of the politics, the government type, the system it is. None of those things keep the kingdom from advancing. And that's why it advances in communist China, it advances in Africa, it advances in Europe, even in the deadness of a post-Christian kind of reality, it advances in America. Because that's what God's about. He's about calling people out of every tribe and nation and tongue, and he's going to do it.
Yep, Jesus is alive and on the throne, and no one is rolling that stone back. And so he's on the loose.
All right. And that, we're going to close that question because we have a lot more I want to go through. All right. Next question. To what degree should the church be involved in responding to more grievous sins committed by the government, such as abortion, suppression of religious freedom, persecution, and various civil rights issues? Again, not my phrasing, reading the question as it came in, just saying. So.
No, yeah, that's, I guess my answer is more going to reframe the question, because I think that this is the difficulty of, okay, how do you keep the gospel mission and the unity of the church primary, but recognize that these are the issues in our culture, these are the injustices, and God's heart cares, like God cares about them, and so what's my responsibility? I think the way that Don phrased it is at least a helpful way forward, if I don't know exactly what this looks like. It's that the church's role is to equip the saints to go out and represent Jesus in whatever sphere he's placed them in, including those issues where he sees fit. And so, we're not going to be a political action committee. We're not going to, be preaching politics and this issue and that issue and this news thing and that news thing. We want to preach the gospel and preach the word and equip people, do things like this to help people, disciple people, and think through things so that you can go out and you can advocate for the unborn and you can work for justice and you can I don't know. You and I talk about this a lot if you want to add to that.
I agree. I think.
So this is something that you guys spend a lot of time thinking about.
Oh yeah,
This is not something you take lightly.
Because believe me, these are not kind of open and shut issues related to the church.
Hence the raging dumpster fire.
The church's involvement in things like this, and churches have a spectrum of views on this, and so I'm not going to sit here and say that we're right and everybody else is wrong, or the way I would say this, everybody else is. But my best understanding would be that the church's role is to equip the saints with the biblical truth around those kinds of issues.
And you mean to define terms like the church institutional,
Yes.
like us as the body and as leaders, this is our job.
So that they can then, as you said, go out into the world in whatever their spheres of influence are, represent that truth and seek to live that truth out and be an influence for that truth. And if they're engaged in politics, hopefully that would be a sphere that that truth could be. But how people vote, whatever the issues are. So that's I think the church's role. Personally, I feel really, really strongly, and these guys know this, that our mission is the gospel. That's what the church has been called to do. Nobody else has that mission. And I don't want that mission to get mixed up with other missions, though they may be good things that might, be beneficial in the world we live in. That's not our mission.
I totally agree with that. I think that one of the things I was thinking about as we were talking was just the reality of, like, from the pulpit, the primary diet should never be the political thing of the day. The primary diet is the gospel. And that's the thing we want to hammer home again and again and again. That influences how we think about politics. But we can also look at, there's no Christian side of the aisle. And so therefore we can look at both sides and say, there's things that are good and there's things that are bad on both sides of this aisle, every side of the aisle. And so we can look at that and kind of filter that through biblical truth, through things like these, like you're saying. But the primary diet from up front should never be anything other than the gospel. Yeah,
and if I can just say, like, that's been really challenging this last year or so, as in this cultural storm that we're living in. And so, the way that we've tried to navigate that, and I don't know, I think we've done better or worse, and you can be the judge of that. The way we've tried to navigate that is trying to stick with a preaching schedule and gospel diet, but there are things that come up. Like a year ago, COVID upended our preaching schedule. It's like we're gonna adjust because let's see what God would have to say to us in this situation, because this is affecting the people of God. And that was also why this similar thought as to why we paused 2 weeks last summer to talk about grace and race and the gospel and racial injustice, because it wasn't just an issue that was out there. It was an issue pressing in on people here and affecting people here. And so we're like, okay, how do we navigate this as a family?
Yeah.
Quick plug, if you haven't listened to the Race and Grace class on YouTube channel, do it.
Yeah.
Well, just to be clear, because I'm not positive, this person may be thinking more about the mobilization of the body of the church in responding to these things, and just in case that is more part of their question, as opposed to what you guys are doing in-house, how would you answer it for that? Like, what is the role of the church in the mobilization of responding to those grievances?
Yeah, I don't know that I would answer it any differently than I answered it a minute ago. I think our role is to equip God's people with the biblical truth, and then have them go out into the world to represent that truth in whatever sphere of influence that they have. So to me, that's I don't know that I would go beyond that. I'm not trying to mobilize the church around a political cause or issue.
So there is no right or wrong on how one should biblically respond to some of these specific issues that you're going to lay out.
For example, I think about, like, if someone wanted to, because of their biblical truth and biblical identity, wanted to organize a group to go down to the March for Life. That's not something we're going to promote up front, but if people want to organize together and go down, by all means, it's a playing out of their faith in their life, and wanting to live out what they're believing is truth in the Christian sphere.
But you also would or wouldn't feel that they need your blessing to go do that. You would just say, more power to you.
Yep.
Go for it.
Man, if like a community group wants to do that, awesome. Praise God.
Okay, cool. All right, I'm going to move on. There's no way we're going to get through all these in this amount of time, so we can either run over or you guys are going to have to talk a lot shorter. Either way, I'll let you pick.
Or both.
Okay, more of both.
Yikes,
All
talk
right.
shorter.
I know. What is your source of information? How much time do you feel is warranted to be informed but not consumed? I'm assuming this is around media and trying to glean information about what's going on this topic.
Boy, that's a really good question, because I've really wrestled with just how do you do that in a way that doesn't make you vulnerable to what to me is kind of the propaganda war on both sides of this culture war. And I know we've talked about this, And when I think about it, to me, I think, okay, if I want to get, a factual rendition of, the news, so to speak, where would I go to do that?
Yeah.
And I think it's hard. And I think as we talked about it, I think what I came up with is I think the best place to do that is my local news on TV, by Channel 11, Channel 13, because in my experience, they at least make an attempt to try to report things accurate. Now, the problem is they don't cover everything. And but I think when you move into the cable news and things like that, that's not news. That's
Political
that's
entertainment is what they call it.
agenda-driven content,
Yeah.
and it's on both sides, And I think, and I've experienced myself, checking into that on a regular basis, and I can feel my heart and my emotions getting engaged in that. And how could those people do, And so I've personally kind of stepped back from all that and try to not get engaged in that kind of stuff, because I just don't know if you're getting a factual rendition of what's going on.
And I thought your suggestion of like local news was intriguing to me. I hadn't thought about that before, but I see some pros to that. That you're right that to I think hard to find really good, solid, unbiased information anywhere, but to a much greater extent than the national cable networks, local news is trying to just kind of report the stories. And then, I also think it brings it down to a local, actionable scale a little bit. Like they might be talking about, here's this issue in our country, but it's like, here's what's going on in Baltimore. And I think just like any time that I can move something from just a big issue to like people is a good thing. And so maybe bringing it to a little bit of a more local level can help me in that cause of loving my neighbor.
No, for me, like I'm not a big news watcher, just because I got so sick of all the opinions being spouted, not actually just giving me the information. So a lot of times I'll read articles online. What I'll do is I'll purposely take an issue I see, and I'll read an article on, for example, like a Fox News, and I'll go over to CNN and read the same thing there. And I imagine the truth's probably somewhere between those two. So it's like
They agreed on a few things somewhere throughout.
Yeah, so it's like being able to take the pieces from both sides. Say, all right, like where is the opinion in these pieces? Where is the actual like what took place? And it's I mean, again, still half the articles are opinion more so than actual what took place. But at least if I'm reading multiple pieces on multiple sides, I'm able to see, okay, what are the things that actually what took place? What are the ones that they're highlighting this to focus their agenda? They're highlighting this. I can kind of piece those together and say, all right, here's maybe what took place. Now I can form my opinion off of that. But it's not. I don't spend a ton of time on those things because it drives me crazy because it's so opinion driven.
Yeah, I mean, a couple things that I would just say in my own experience is one, pay attention to how much your intake is, because if you really kind of just stay in tune with that all the time, it's going to shape the way you think and respond. And be alert. Be alert that what you're probably getting in many of those sources is a perspective driven by one side of that culture war. And don't be so quick to assume that perspective is necessarily factual, because we all know that you can take two people looking at the same event and they can come up with two very different interpretations of that event. And that's, I think, a lot of what you get. And it's it really is agenda driven. They're trying to promote a particular view and win you to that view.
Okay. All right. I'm going to move on. Sorry, just because they're flowing in. We're going to run over, and that's okay. I hope you guys are okay that we run over, because I think we want to make sure we cover all these. So I'm going to rapid fire a sequence of questions that are going to go in a block here. Okay. Do you think that more Christians are rising up politically because of all of the government's abuse of power in 2020? Do you think that our country and world is in the mess that it's in because the church has not operated in the power and authority that God has given to it? Could what's going on in our country and world be a result of a spiritual battle that has increased in intensity? Could God actually be stirring a remnant of his people to stand and fight? I know it's a lot. Sorry. Rapid fire sequence of questions.
Yeah, so I might take that from like the back and work
Okay.
work backwards. that I do think there's a spiritual battle. Obviously, there's a spiritual battle. The Bible tells us that we're in a spiritual battle.
But about the kingdom, not about politics specifically.
So yeah, be careful, because our weapons are not of this world. Corinthians tells us that our struggle is not against flesh and blood. Ephesians tells us, and so if we find that we are fighting with the same weapons of the world, we're on the wrong side. Because so in this war,
Or we're in the wrong war.
That's what I was gonna say.
maybe that's a better way to put it. Yeah, we're in the wrong war.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because there are two wars going on. Yeah, that's a better. Yeah, I retract what I said. Better way to say it. There are two wars going on. There's this left-right battle raging over differing definitions of what is good and true and right and what America should be. And then there is another different war that intersects with this war with that first war in a different way. And this is the spiritual war for the souls of people, and for the witness of the church. And so if we are fighting this left-right, this left-right battle is not the spiritual battle. And so we just need to be really careful not to equate those.
Let me know if I need to rephrase or redo the question too, because I know it was a lot.
No, what I was thinking was Spirit. I think the Spirit was bringing to mind was I want to reframe this completely in some respects. Of oftentimes we think that the question in my mind is what war are we fighting? What agenda are we fighting for? And in some respects, it's I think about oftentimes we think this world of if we can have the politics reflect our agenda, we can win people for Christ through those things. And I oftentimes think that maybe it's just the wrong attitude altogether, because I think about gospel multiplication. If you think about one of the age-old things, looking at 2 Timothy 2:2 and the passing down of the gospel, if you have someone like a Billy Graham who's sharing Christ and winning 5,000 souls a day, and you have on the other hand just faithful multiplication of two, sharing of two, and that multiplying out, the gospel actually goes forth and the world is transformed by the gospel much quicker through multiplication than it is through the addition. And so I think oftentimes we're thinking like, oh, if we can just win it this way, we'll win the nation through this way. And so we're like, really, no, what ultimately wins the ultimate war is people who are faithfully living out their life, faithfully sharing the gospel, multiplying their faith, and that's going to advance the kingdom so much better than large-scale efforts that we think oftentimes they're the more flashy thing, they're the more easy thing to see. But it's that faithful, day in, day out, sharing the gospel, reaching people, that's ultimately what changes people's lives and quote-unquote wins the war in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the other thing is, if we look back over the history of the church, since the time the church was formed, there have been numerous times throughout the history of the church where the church and political power got united, where what people would like to see happen in America, in some sense, has happened. It has never gone well for the kingdom and the church in those situations.
For example?
Well, the Crusades would be one example. The Middle Ages would be even Rome, when Christianity was made the official nation, the official religion of the Roman Empire. It was the deterioration of the church that resulted in that. So whenever politics and religion get wed together, in this world, politics always comes out and the church suffers. And where the church has done the best is when the political structures were against the church. And the church was persecuted and really, you would think would be at a significant disadvantage. That's when the gospel has seemed to flourish the most. So it is an upside down kingdom. It doesn't work the way we would think it does.
Yeah, it's Corinthians. It's the weakness and foolishness of the cross, and the weakness and foolishness of a suffering people following Jesus, that this is how the kingdom advances.
I want to reread pieces of the question I'm not sure if we touched on. Do you think that our country and world is in the mess that it's in because the church has not operated in the power and authority that God has given to it? And could God actually be stirring a remnant of his people to stand and fight? I don't know that we've covered that, so briefly.
And that's how I go back to what war we're fighting for. Are we fighting
Okay.
for the kingdom war? Or are we fighting the politically driven war?
Yeah, because I think if
Well, comment on the
by-
other one too, about the church's role in this. Is this an opposition thing? Because I don't know that we're addressing that in our answer at this time, unless you want to tie it all together.
Here we go. in a
Unless
bow.
it is, and
No,
I'm
I-
not getting it, so please
But
do.
the power and authority that God has given us by his Spirit is the power and authority to take up our cross and follow him, and to lay down our lives, to be servants and exiles, and preach the gospel and see God save people by his power. That's the power and authority that he's given us in this age.
Are we feeling like we answered that question thoroughly?
What was it?
The
Read that
part,
again.
okay. Do you think that our country and world is in the mess that it's in because the church has not operated in the power and authority that God has given to it? And could God actually be stirring a remnant of his people to stand and fight?
Yeah, I think, and again, this is my opinion here. I think there's an assumption sometimes that's made, and I hear it in a lot of different forms. It's kind of the assumption that if the church just was the church that it should be, there wouldn't be hunger. You know, there wouldn't be poverty. There wouldn't be all these things. I just don't know that I buy that kind of reasoning. I think the church is always going to be somewhat of an outcast, so to speak, in the world. And that the church, you know, this idea of the church rising up and being the church that it should be, I think the church, the church moves forward in weakness, and you know what I mean? I don't think we're to be the power structure of the world and transform. That's not the way the kingdom goes forth. So I don't particularly agree with that idea that if the church was, you know, who the church would be. Now, could the church be better? There's no question that
Can
there's.
we answer the question, do you think that God, I mean, there is sometimes this concept, I think, that we can see twinges of in Scripture that I think people might be trying to apply here. So let me dip into that real quick. This idea of if you're not walking in step with being exactly what God wanted you to be or the way he's called you to live, that he might withdraw himself or remove some blessing and kind of change the scape of things. Sort of like what we see at different times with a rebellious Israel. When we look at Scripture where they're not really walking with him, they're not doing as he would call them to do, and so he kind of pulls himself back and things start to shift. They reshape. There's new power. There's takeovers. There's all kinds of things. I'm not saying that's what this person's asking, but in case that is more in line with what they're trying to get at in regards to the church's responsibility in this world, is this a part of our result for our own behavior?
Yeah, and phooey, I had a thought.
And it ran right out.
I think I'm going to try to get it back. I think to your question, the way that you phrased that question, that God does. There is this. Okay, I got my thought.
You got it back? Okay.
I think I got it
Step in
back.
if you don't. Okay.
Let's do it.
That there is a sense, of course, in which walking in wisdom and righteousness, and any nation walking in wisdom and righteousness, like that works well, because that's living along the grain of God's reality. And so I would distinguish that from saying that God blesses that as something. But it's just like life goes well when you live it God's way. Proverbs.
The classic reaping and sowing reality.
You know, that's just kind of that's just how God has set up his moral universe to work. That to me is different than saying that that if the church would be the church, that God would bless America, because God doesn't work with nations in that same way that he works with Israel, in a covenant with Israel, and saying, walk in my ways and I will bless you. That's what he says to his people, the church. And so it's not, it's the classic in Chronicles, if my people pray, I will, hear from heaven and turn and heal their land. That's not a red, white, and blue Bible verse. That's not a promise to America. That's a promise to to God's people, and it was made to Israel. And so now now in the new covenant, it's being said to the church that if my people will pray and humble and turn from their wicked ways, our wicked ways that are in here in this room, then I will heal you and I'll make your light shine and stuff. And like, maybe it will go better for America if the church can be the church, but those are not a one-to-one thing.
Yeah, it goes back to something we talked about before, is the fact that America is not Israel, and the nation has shifted from the literal nation to the people, to kind of sum up what you're saying.
So is it true even for the church then? So like if this concept of walking with me in blessing versus opposition from the Lord, are you applying that biblically to the concept of the church as God's people? That would still apply? Because I think if I'm using their
Yes.
question, could
Yeah.
the world be
Like Jesus in the letters to the churches in Revelation is like, if you don't do this, I'll come and I'll remove my lamps and I'll remove my presence from you. He's not talking to a nation, he's talking to a church.
Right, so if I use their question, could this all be happening because the church is not operated in the power and authority that God has given to it? What is your answer to that?
So I think this might not be the way the question is intended, but
And it
I
may
would
not be,
but
but,
I would say
I'm covering it in case.
that yes, the turmoil and division in the church, in God's holy nation, is happening because we are not walking in the power and authority of the weakness and humbleness and way of the cross that he calls us to. And that's the chaos in the church, is because we're not doing that.
Other thoughts on that before I move on? The last
yeah.
call before I run, because that
I
was a
mean,
long one.
these are tough things to sort through.
And we still got 8 more to go.
How much different would things be if the church was different? Who really knows? So is it possible that if the church was better at being the church they should be, that things would be different?
Yeah.
Maybe.
If we had a more effective and winsome witness, if more people were coming to Christ, if revival sweeps the land, that would result in a church that is strong and representing Jesus well. And so in a democracy, that would have some ripple effects. Praise God. But I don't think that would necessarily accomplish a list of political.
But I think the equation you just did is exactly right. It's that order of, it's not trying to flip that and accomplish the political thing first that leads to more people. It's more people that then lead to a changing of society.
Yeah.
Ripple effect goes.
Maybe, yeah.
It goes the way you're saying. Not if you flip that, it changes the equation completely.
Yeah, and I think maybe a concluding thought on this, when I think about how God relates to the church, I kind of think about it of how God relates to an individual believer. You're a work in progress, right? And you're always going to be a work in progress. So there's always going to be things in your life that aren't what they should be. Yet there is a grace that covers that to where God's purpose in your life will be fulfilled. And I think that's true with the church. Jesus said, I'm going to build my church, and nothing's going to stop me. And the ups and downs, and if we think this is a downtime, boy, you look at church history, there's been some down times that would make this one look like revival almost. But through it all, God's kingdom purposes are not thwarted, and Jesus will fulfill his promise, and the church will, he will bring it to its completion. He will not lose one that the Father has sent him and given him, and it'll all come to pass. And yet we walk down this road in weakness and imperfection, but the grace of God is bigger than those things.
Would it be fair to say that it might be better to focus on actually walking with God and not be as concerned about trying to interpret results as
I think that's great advice.
as a byproduct? Because I think sometimes it's easy for us to look at our surroundings since we're told to look for fruit. And if things look like they're going bad, then we assume that means that we're doing something wrong. And sometimes in an upside-down kingdom, that's not always 100% correct, it would seem.
Remember how Paul I evaluated his ministry in 2 Corinthians. It's like, all these bad things happen to me. God's at work.
Yeah.
That's not how we think.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'll add to the question is just the reality of I don't think no matter how good the church is doing, we'll never completely negate the effects of sin in our world. And so we can do good things all over the place, but in some reality, Satan's at work as well, and there will be bad things that happen in this world. It's not until the future hope of the new kingdom that we'll see those things actually disappear.
Yeah, and I think if we're going to use the Israel reference that I know a lot of people use, I think one distinguishing factor there, if I'm right, and tell me if I'm wrong, is they were in direct opposition, blatant opposition to God, his ways, and his rule. It wasn't a, we keep slipping into not doing things right. It was a, we're not walking with you. We're just not going to do that right now. We think we have other things, better ways, other, gods. So I think it would be, when God kind of said, okay, I'm going to let you walk like that, I'm going to let you taste that, just to have them run back. I think it's a little bit different than people who are truly trying to walk with the Lord and are struggling and stumbling and falling as they seek to do that, versus a church who would be living in opposition to Scripture blatantly. I don't know, I mean, you guys can answer, if God would directly oppose a body who's truly trying to follow him and honor him and walk with him the same way that he would someone who's just reinterpreting for their own.
And that's true in the church and in the context of the gospel.
Okay.
Yeah, that's...
And correct me if I'm wrong. I'm
One of the things we
spitballing
talked
here.
about in small group multiple times, one of the things I've talked to multiple guys about recently is just the matter of Jesus is concerned with the heart. That's what he's focused on. And so the outward actions might look different people, but it's about the heart. Where's our heart with the Lord?
And I think of John 15, when in reference to that question that Jesus said, I'm the vine, you're the branches, and every branch in me that bears fruit, the Father prunes it that it may bear much fruit. So I think if, as we wrestle to kind of walk with God through this thing, there will be a pruning and a purifying, and that's not always pleasant. But God's doing that to, further the holiness and righteousness and purposes of the kingdom.
Okay.
And God does not deal with nations on the basis of works righteousness. It's not a prosperity gospel for America that if we obey that he'll bless us. Like, that's not how God deals with nations. Every nation is in rebellion against God. Doesn't matter who the president is. And America's in rebellion against God, not because we have a Democratic president or a Republican president or this law or that law. It's because this is a sinful, fallen, broken world, and God has sent the church into that world to save people through the gospel.
All right, next question, because again, we got to keep moving it. We're going to be here forever. How would you talk to a Christian who turned patriotism into believing conspiracy theories like Q? Again, reading the questions, not stating personal opinions here, but reading the questions as they come in.
Again, I just think you have to be careful out there in the media world that we're in right now, because we live in a world where anybody can have a platform. Social media provides the opportunity for anyone to kind of say anything they want to say and to do whatever they want to do to try to promote something, regardless of how sound or crazy it might be. And that's just the world we live in. And so I just think it calls for being discerning and recognizing that there are people who try to take advantage of that reality. And you just need to try to be wise and use sources that you trust.
Well, it sounds like from the question, it's they know someone, so it's like, how do we respond to our friend?
Well, there's two pieces of it.
Yeah.
I think there's that
And
piece,
so I think
and then
part
there's
of it is
also
the evaluation of one, trustworthiness of news sources, things like that. And part of it is trying to figure out, okay, we're not supposed to necessarily judge the other person, but how do we, with that, in speaking the truth in love, be able to walk alongside of brother, figure out, okay, am I the person God has put in their life that can kind of speak truth to them and kind of walk through them in a loving manner, to be able to walk through, how do we evaluate these sources? How do we think through these things in light of God's kingdom, in light of the gospel? How do we then evaluate some of these pieces? And just having to evaluate yourself, like, am I that person, or is somebody else actually where God has called that person into that person's life? And then be able to walk alongside them in love and talk through, hey, let's think about trustworthiness of sources. Let's think through how are we putting these things in relation to our Christian identity and our gospel identity, all that kind of stuff, our witness, etc. Yeah,
and I think maybe I've given this a lot of a lot of thoughts, and maybe this is helpful, maybe it's not going to make any sense. But I think maybe a way to help evaluate and combat conspiracy theory thinking, rather than go with the what's a trustworthy source, not trustworthy, because like that's just really hard to know, and you can kind of get into a worldview box where like you would say that is a trustworthy source even if it's not. Perhaps I want to come at it from a different angle. That one of the commonalities of conspiracy theories is the assuming the worst about other people's motives in a way that makes them part of some evil. And so, so Q is definitely, the QAnon conspiracy theory is definitely that. It's not just that there are people who disagree with you politically. It's that there are these Satanist cabal of pedophiles trying to take over the world. And so any sort of agenda or theory or explanation for what's going on in the world, if it's asking you to assume the worst about somebody, stay away. Because the issue, because that right there is you're crossing into sin. The moment you start believing the worst about people, you're in sin. Because 1 Corinthians 13 says that love believes all things, hopes all things. Like love assumes the best. Love extends charitable interpretation to other people's value, to other people's decisions and what they're doing. And so a conspiracy theory turns that on its head and says, no, there's this sinister evil motive. And so I would say, like, as a Christian, you're commanded to not believe that about people. And so any sort of agenda that's telling you to believe that, run away.
At least without facts.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I just was listening to a podcast 2 weeks ago about human trafficking. There's a guy who was a former military pararescue guy, and then he worked in the CIA for a little while. He's like, there's a lot of things I can't tell you because of my NDA coming out of the government. And so in some respects, there's probably things going on behind the scenes that we will never know about because of security clearance, et cetera. But one of the things he was saying, the point he made, which I thought was so valid and I hadn't thought about before, was he's like, look, there's certain things I can't say because of my NDA. And honestly, if there's somebody else who's saying they know it, and there's two possibilities. One, they're just speaking out of their butt and they really don't know. Or maybe they do know and they're violating their NDA. So what does that say about their integrity and actually their ability to speak truth if they're willing to go against their own word and say they won't share it? I was like, I had never thought about that way before. Of like, does that affect how we think about their word if they're willing to break their word in other circumstances?
So like, yeah, it's a messed up world, and there are bad people, and it's us, and we do bad things. The problem with the world is me, and so yeah, I think approaching new sources of information with kind of a skepticism and discernment, and then approaching people with charity and assuming the best. Those two things are probably the best defense against conspiracy thinking.
Do you think it's appropriate to take on as a believer role of truth bearer or teller in the name of Christ, or even the biblical principles you guys just laid out? Is that appropriate to take on that responsibility with other believers or other people? Is that actually our job?
Like
to
to correct
that?
people when they're wrong?
Like to try to, I mean, people are going to say, we're trying to bring some truth, we're trying to bring some accuracy, trying to bring some perspective. Is that truly the believer's job to instill and make some of that stuff happen? Like, what is your actual role in that process? Because maybe that will help this person figure
To
out
the
how to
world around
approach.
us, not necessarily, but we're called to walk alongside our brothers and sisters in Christ. And if we're in community and a church together, there is a responsibility of walking alongside and bringing truth and love to our brothers and sisters in Christ. But to the world around us, that's not necessarily our responsibility. as
Yeah,
much.
and so, Ephesians, speaking the truth in love, we're supposed to grow up into him who's the head. So that means that people like to take the speak the truth in love and kind of pull that out of context. Speaking the truth in love, or to grow up into him who's the head. So your truth and love that you're speaking is to help me and you look more like Jesus. And truth in love which believes all things and hopes all things and endures all things. And so if you can do that, if you can speak truth in a way that assumes the best and extends charity and is patient and kind the goal is to help you and me both be more like Jesus, then speak the truth.
Now, before we proceed, I still have 9 questions left. Okay, 9. And we're already over by a good few minutes. My question to you guys, do we want to just plow ahead and give everyone what they want in one shot, or do you want to break it up and go to part 2? I don't care. I'm fine to keep going and let people go back for it as they see fit if they have to walk away right now. What do you want to do? Because I know we want to answer.
We did not prepare
them.
for that question.
I know we want to answer them. So it's a question, do you want to try to do it now, or do you want to try to come back?
My thought is this: we're on the topic. Let's discuss it and go forward. It'll all be on YouTube. So if someone wants to come back later and do it
it will all be
again,
accessible.
it'll be easy to go back and listen to there.
Yes.
Since we're here and the questions are here,
Okay.
I think we go for it.
Are you guys
and
okay to
then,
continue?
So
we can
feel free to
Okay.
fast forward through the stuff
All right.
that you don't care about.
I just
to
want to
get your
know. All
question.
right.
Yeah, it's all
So
you can go back and listen to it at your leisure.
for the public,
whatever
we're going
time
to
you want.
disregard the time restraints. This is the first time we're doing it. We're going to actually just make sure we answer your questions.
Here
So
we go.
I can't promise when it'll end. Hopefully, not too badly. But
But does that mean maybe at this point that we could at least cut off the questions?
sure. I mean, if you have more, send them in, but we may not add them to the pile. We might have to come back for them in some other way. I'll do it that way. Okay. Because I want to ask the questions. These are good. All right. Is there a line in the sand as to unity at any cost? For example, in America, we are beyond political parties. There is a definite good versus evil as quickly as things are transpiring. So how can we have unity when there is support of those who support evil?
Well, there's good and evil on both political parties. Let's just be clear about that. And so when we talk about unity at all costs, or when we talk about unity, let's just be clear again that we're talking about the church. What Jesus prayed for is that his people would be unified. Not that, obviously I want, the United States to be unified.
And I'm unclear as
but-
to if this question is directed at the church or at the nation. It's not
Yeah.
specified.
Yeah,
So
initial read, I definitely hear some assumptions built in, but it could be, I could be
Yes.
hearing it differently too.
I'm just saying that I cannot discern. But they clearly feel that there is a good and a bad side
Well,
to this, whatever it be.
Let me just address it from the church. I do not believe that unity at all costs is a legitimate biblical position.
Unity within the church or
Yes,
unity
within the
nation?
church,
Okay.
because truth matters. And so, you're to speak the truth in love. Love alone without truth is not a sufficient basis for unity. So there are things where truth can mean that I can't be united with you, if we disagree, on gospel truth or things like that. So unity does have some limits, but I think, who was it that said, unity in the essentials, but charity in the things that, that's a terrible
I'm trying to remember the quote now.
summary
Was that
of that quote.
Augustine?
But the idea is that, we need to hold fast to the things that are essential to the truth of the gospel. But in the things that are more peripheral, let's give charity to be able to disagree on and still be united around.
Yeah, and there are, a helpful way to think about this is, so again, we're talking in the church, there are kind of three levels. There are the gospel essentials that are like, this is what makes you a believer. This is what makes you part of the family of God, and these are essentials, and these are not negotiable. This is the faith delivered once for all for the saints. Down from that, there are lots of doctrinal disagreements that people can have and in that there are so different churches, infant baptism, adult baptism, predestination, free will, and as a church we have opinion on those things, and on some of those things, some churches are right and some are wrong, and we are who we are because we believe some of those distinctives. Now I'm not shunning you if you.
You mean right and wrong in the sense that if they're all so different, most likely not all of them can be
Yeah,
right?
like one of
or-
them, one of them's true, one of them's not.
In a provable way, or you're saying not in a provable way?
At least in a way that we'll figure out when we get there.
So you're saying not in a provable way.
Yeah.
Okay.
But and in those things, like a lot of those things might be important things, that these are what give rise to denominations. And so like, and so maybe we can't be in the same church together, but I can love you, and in the broader body of Christ we are unified because of those essentials. And then there's the down from that, the third level of just debatable and conscience issues and the application of lots of different things, and that's where even in a church that has those core doctrinal things, people are going to disagree on those of who is the best candidate to vote for, what's the best way to advance this cause of justice and righteousness, what's more important, this issue or this issue. And those are the areas that we got to give each other space on. It's like, it's okay if you think that this is the most important issue, and I think this is like political issue, and I think this is the most important political issue. We can and should and must still have unity in the gospel.
Okay.
Can you read the question one more time? I had some
I
thoughts.
can, because we got time. Is there a line in the sand as to unity at any cost? For example, in America, we are beyond political parties. There is a definite good versus evil as quickly as things are transpiring. So how can we have unity when there is support of those who support evil?
Yeah, my assumption, I think, would definitely be they're thinking more in the political realm, not necessarily church realm. So it's harder to really fully address that well. But I think, as you were saying, like the idea of there's good and bad on both sides of the aisle there. And I was talking with a friend not long ago and talking about how there's hypocrisy on all sides in everything. And so it's like being able to look at those different pieces and see the hypocrisy of both parties politically, and be able to then see that neither one of them fully fits the gospel agenda going forward.
Yeah, and if you are seeing people through a lens of good versus evil, can I just plead with you that you're fighting the wrong war? Because that's our mission field. Those are the people that Jesus has sent you to love, even if they're wrong, especially if they're wrong.
And you are not good. It's
And
probably
you're
good
not good.
clarifying. I don't know who asked this, so I can say this with full confidence, because I'm not either. Like, there are, even as believers, that doesn't make us good people. So I think if you're feeling like you're on the good side, I think there may be some questions to be asked there, possibly.
Yeah, and I think just be careful you're not being sucked into this culture war and buying into one side or the other, because the strategy is to make the other side be evil. That's the game.
Yeah.
And so be careful you don't buy into that.
And now, there was, I think, a nuance in that question that maybe part of what the question meant is, how can I have unity in the church if you have this political position that I think is on like the evil side?
Yes, I think that's what we're getting.
And so that's a really good question.
Yes.
Because
Which, quick plug, next month we're talking about the topic of practically loving people and how do we love people we don't disagree with.
Eric with the plug.
come
Way to
back
go.
next month.
That was well done.
And so and that's tricky, because we're gonna politics, we're gonna work this out in different ways, and there are political positions that are good and political positions that are wrong. I think one of the things that I would encourage is that if you're concerned that a person is holding a position that is associated with evil, can you ask for some clarification? Because you might be surprised that just because they voted for this candidate does not necessarily mean that they support the entire platform of that party and every plank in it. I think that as human beings, we're capable of a little more nuance than that. But we keep trying to put people into boxes and just the good and evil because we keep getting drawn into that war.
Yeah, but I would also caution you, because if people are as good or as bad as the choices that they make, then I would say everybody's in a lot of trouble, just broadly speaking. So,
and that's why our agenda is the gospel.
yeah, I don't know if you really want to play the game you think you're playing right now, because that's going to have a lot of implications for yourself and everybody else on the planet, and I think you might not be thinking through all of that. unless you feel that this is a greater evil than other evils, which
Well, you know what's
maybe.
fascinating about this culture war is if you're on one side, you're good and the other side's evil. If you're on the other side, you're good and the other side is evil. So that should alert us that there's probably some middle ground somewhere.
Do you remember when Joshua, before the Battle of Jericho, and he meets the commander of the armies of the Lord, and Jericho is, and Joshua's in that battle mindset, and so he says, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" Remember the angel's response? Neither.
And there it is.
There it is.
Yeah. I mean, I think the short and sweet answer to some degree, if I'm summing up what you guys are saying, is even if you do feel that there's good versus evil, which I think you guys have addressed that whole concept already, as previously stated, I think God is bigger than all of that. So even if you want to boil life down to a good versus evil battle, he's still in control, doing exactly what he plans and intends to do through all evil that may take place on this planet.
Yeah. And again, there is a
find
good
peace in
versus
that.
evil battle. This is the
Yes.
real war that's been fought is a battle of good versus evil, and evil was triumphed over on the cross.
Yes.
There's a battle of good versus evil. All of us are on the wrong side of that war. And so the gospel message is that we, as rebels on the wrong side of that, can be brought over to the good side by faith in Jesus.
Yes. So even if you are misapplying your good versus evil battle, however you want to apply it correctly or incorrectly, I think God's still in control to work through that the way that he intends to, and nothing is going to stop him. So if that brings you any peace to back off from your level of concern of, well, what happens if, or I don't like this, I think you're okay to do that, to put that aside. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I would just add, I get the struggle with this stuff because, you know, we have families, we have children, we're looking at the world we live in, our views, our values, whatever they may be, and we're wondering what's it going to be like 10, 20 years from. So I get the concern. I think the challenge for us as believers is we can't let these worldly concerns dominate us so much that they become the center of our solar system. Because God's still on the throne. He's still in control. He's still going to bring about his purposes in his timing, his way, and he's going to accomplish every one of them. And that's what we have to put our hope in. That's what we have to try to find our rest in. Because we are not the first Christians that have gone through political systems that were very against Christianity in the church. Be glad you didn't live in first century Rome.
Yeah.
And in first century Rome, Paul says, you know, be subject for the Lord's sake
Exactly.
to that emperor.
Yeah, and so what a statement of how the kingdom operates. It's exactly the opposite of what we would think in this struggle that so many people feel politically. Actually, the way the kingdom works is be submissive, be obedient, even to authorities like that. You know.
And also to not trust in just what we can see and understand in our
Right.
own eyes as people, because God is working on a greater level than what we're looking at
in
here.
those moments of first century Rome, with everything that going on, the gospel thrived and the gospel went forth and the church exploded.
Yeah, and you know, Titus 3:1-2, great verse. Paul's writing that in the midst of the persecution of Nero that's going on, but remind them to be obedient to authorities, to be submissive, to avoid quarreling, to speak evil of no one. You know, that's our call as believers in the midst of times like this. Doesn't mean it's not real, and we don't feel that.
But you don't need to be the person to go expose all of that, or, you know,
and
crusade for
in our
truth.
political context, what a blessing that we have the ability, in a way that first century Christians didn't, to even to have our voices heard and to work for change and you know, like that's great, but that's not our hope. That's not how the kingdom advances.
Yeah.
And in the midst of all of that, we still have to do Titus 3.
All right, so moving to the next question. What insights or advice can you give for those in a close relationship that have wildly divergent, incompatible views that cause friction? I know. They're killing us today, aren't they? They're on fire
It
with the
is,
questions.
when Jesus said, I didn't come to bring peace, but a sword, and brother against sister, I don't know that this is what he had in mind, but I think it's really challenging. I know families personally that they can't have a conversation about these kind of things at the dinner table because there's so much animosity and hostility around these types of issues. And I feel like we're beating a drum here, but what it says
Themes are emerging.
is these things have become too important in your world when you can't relate to someone else.
Well, let me take it to a different place then, because, and I may be overinterpreting the question, but let me take it to somewhere we haven't discussed. So say you're dealing with someone where maybe, the symptoms might point that it's clearly very important for them, but maybe you are trying to put this aside, but even in you doing that, there is still a tension, because even if you're not trying to fight with someone, knowing the difference when this is important to someone else can create a tension that you have to then figure out how to deal with. And if you're seeking to honor the Lord in this, how do you handle that? Because now we're beyond just me trying to do what you guys have already talked about. There's the real life reality of what's still going to go on in the tension. Maybe you can't talk. Maybe you can't be in the same room because that person keeps bringing it to you and coming at you. So say you're in the I'm being attacked position on something like this, not doing the attacking. Because I think we've addressed the doing the attacking. Let's flip it. So how would you biblically
I
try to
don't-
have someone
I don't know
walk
that the
through
principles change. I think
Is this just listening? Is it just being humble? Like, what are we? And I'm not just looking at him. I'm looking at him because he's talking, but you too.
I think your goal as a believer is to always respond in a way that adorns the gospel. So, appealing that you don't want to argue about these things, whatever might make sense in the context of that relationship as a way to avoid that. But because generally I think it takes kind of two to tango, so to speak. And if you are humble and seeking to, be gracious and not attack and defend, and it's hard to argue. So I think, just try to be that kind of gospel person. And if you get attacked, then bear under that, because what you're trying to do is to represent Christ. And that's part of what he calls you to do. Sometimes there will be some sacrifice and suffering to do that. Now, that's not a complete answer that, solves problems for families that are together all the time and have these issues. But I just think all you can do is do what you can to be a peacemaker.
Yeah, and Romans 12, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with all.
How would you respond to people that sometimes, like I've heard people make the argument, if we look at Jesus' life, because obviously he was constantly being tried to, be tripped up and get into arguments with people, but he was very skillful, gracious, almost crafty to a degree, in the words and the way that he would reply
Jesus
to people.
is crafty.
Well, in a good way,
She
not in a
said it.
slimy way, but like he's a wordsmith, he knew how to handle that. Now, personally, I find the difference between him in some of those situations and us is he knew the hearts of man, and we just don't know that. So it makes it very different when people try to compare those two. He can do something we can't, which makes it unique. But if people look at that as an example of how they can or maybe even should respond in debative, argumentative kinds of contexts with people who they don't agree with, do you think that's still in line with biblical principles and thinking, or would you feel like that's a bit of a twisting of a context?
Yeah, because I would say you might be twisting some context because because I see the way time and time again Jesus responding to to rhetorical traps is kind of going after the person's heart, redirecting the question back to their heart. Even in his most fierce rebukes of the Pharisees, you brood of vipers and stuff, he's still weeping over Jerusalem. And so his heart is love for these people. And then, of course, 1 Peter says, gives us the model to follow of pointing, like, if you want to know what would Jesus do, it's when he was reviled, he did not open his mouth, but entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. So you do that.
Okay. Other
I
thoughts?
think the only thing I'd add to the question is there's obviously a lot of unknowns. Is this a boyfriend-girlfriend situation? Is this a marriage? Like, what are the situations? And maybe it's a boyfriend-girlfriend. Maybe it is hey, maybe I need to take a step back for a little while. If it's a marriage and you're committed to be here, I think about things like 1 Corinthians 13 and what it means to love. And love doesn't insist on its own way. Love bears all things. Like, there's some strong commands in there to be patient, to be praying for them, not just to be the fixer, but to be the one that's just praying and letting God. Are you trusting God to be at work in that person's heart? I think the one caveat I would give to that, if there is a situation where it's you use the word attack, and so maybe think of, like, if it's a situation where you're
That's
being
my word
attacked so
choice,
much
yes.
it almost leads to, like, verbal abuse, you may want to have to take some consultation with the pastor, something like that. Try and figure out what the next step is there. If it's not just sitting there and taking that again and again to the point of abuse.
Yeah, one other thing I might add on this is one of the things I've learned in my own life is that most of the time when I am involved in an argument or I'll say an ungracious debate about something, 99 times out of 100, at least this is true for me, I am not representing Jesus' interest. That is not my motive in that moment. But I have found that my motive is I want to be right, and I want to be seen as right, and I want to be acknowledged as being right. And that's what I'm fighting for in that time. And
How's that go for you?
well, I've tried to learn over the years that, because God kind of dropped this on me in the middle of an argument once, and he kind of spoke to me and kind of said, what's more important, you're more concerned about being right and acknowledged as right than valuing this relationship. And that was kind of like a little
Wake-up call.
a little wake-up call that in God's kingdom, he wants me to value the relationship more than whether I'm right or being acknowledged as right. And so if I can lay that down and be willing to let that go and find that, my relationship with this person is more important, it'll help me navigate through that conversation.
That's good. Other thoughts? No? I'm going to move on. All right. What priority should we give to political matters related to biblical prophecy? For example, defense of Jerusalem and Israel. Are these matters of personal conscience or of obedience to God?
I do think that faithful Christians disagree about matters of kind of eschatology. I think like kind of what they're referring to of like the place of Israel and end times and how you understand all that. That would be one of those three levels. That would be one of those kind of level 2 or like I don't know.
Okay, because
2.5
they're asking
kind of
what's the
things.
priority?
Yeah.
Are they matters of conscience or obedience? So you're saying
a lot
level
of
2 out of a
disagreement with
3-tier
this, yeah.
system, middle of the
Yeah.
road.
I think they're matters of conscience because there's a ton of different legitimate views on those kind of things. And even as a church here, we don't really take a position on eschatological standpoints. And we do classes at times where we teach the different viewpoints and so that people can kind of make up their own mind what they think. But there's just not enough biblical data to tell us kind of the details of those kind of things. So I'd want to be respectful, but not make those matters of, essentials.
And I do think that means because faithful Christians can disagree on, what this in Revelation means or whatever, I do think that means that I have a position on those things. I'm sure the guys on the team all have, but we try to hold that with some, open hands and some humility that that I might be wrong in this, I might not understand all of this, and I'm willing to join hands with anybody, even if they disagree with me on this.
Do you find there's diversity even within the pastoral team on matters like that? I'm not saying you have to get into displaying all of that, but I'm just curious. Have you found
What
like
are you
on
guys?
certain
Like,
matters? I know
I
not
couldn't
everybody
tell you
agrees
last
on
time
I'm
we
trying to
everything.
think of
Remnant
it.
To be
Israel, yeah.
honest, I don't know. I think it's been probably 10 years since
Yeah.
as a pastoral team, we kind of talked through this, and some of these guys weren't here 10 years ago,
Okay.
even when we did that.
I
But
kind of want to do that now. I'm kind of curious.
But if it were, you would not find that a major obstacle to the unity of the team.
no,
I
not at all.
figured as much. I was just asking. I like to stir the pot. All right. How would you advise Christians to engage in the political arena when our culture redefines previously familiar vocabulary? For example, tolerance, marriage, racism, and we do not speak a common language.
Yeah, I think that question itself is really insightful, because I think that highlights the need. As the divide between sides widens, I think we have to be careful to define our terms and to define our own terms, and also to ask for clarification from other people before we assume I know what you mean by that. And
That to me is the biggest thing.
Yeah.
Be able to take time to listen and hear first, understand where they're coming from, understand what they're saying. That actually allows you to have an opportunity to clarify if needed clarification, and actually have a conversation where you're understanding each other rather than just speaking right past each other.
yeah, because that I think that's the source of so much speaking past each other, is we're using the same words and meaning different things. And I think if so often if we could just stop and be like, well, what do you mean by that? Like we might find that we're not that different, but even if we are really different, then at least we know where we're at.
Okay. Ready to move on? Okay, this one's long. That's why I was like, are we ready? Okay. So I'm going to read the whole thing, and then I'll pop my head up. Yes, okay. Do you think, and again, I'm reading something someone else has written. This is not a reflection of the
Lisa.
people on the stage. I'm just going to read it.
This question does not reflect or represent
Well,
my views.
I'm just saying, this isn't my phrasing. I'm literally going to read what someone wrote. Do you think that one reason the church has not been more vocal in important issues that affect our culture and our children's future is because the bias of media has crept in? Could this be an intentional act of Satan to silence the church? Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, "Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. What is going on in our country and world is evil. People are waking up to it. Why are some in the church so reluctant to address policies and laws that are in direct violation of God's word?" I said it was long.
Okay.
If I need to reread any segment of that, let me know,
Yeah,
because I know that
because
was long.
I think there's probably a number of different pieces there that we can interact with. It's a good question. Because one is so maybe one to just kind of say this to get this out of sight is, again, to define our terms and make sure we're talking about the same thing. Is I do want to, as a believer, as a pastor, as a church, I want to speak about issues of evil, and there is right and wrong, but even as I think about as a pastor and my role standing here opening God's word, I want to be really, really careful to only call evil what God has called evil, and conversely to not, I mean, certainly to not call good something that he has called evil. And so there are some clear things. And so even if let's wade into some political stuff, I think scripturally it's really clear that the taking of an innocent human life in the womb is evil. And I'm not afraid to say that from the pulpit as the preaching of God's word would dictate. God's word does not speak on the various pros and cons of certain economic systems. Certainly there's wisdom and stuff. I'm not going to call socialism evil from this pulpit because God's word doesn't. It's not to say it's not evil, it's not to say it's not wrong, but I'm constrained from this pulpit to only call evil what God has called evil. And so we've got to be like, I want to make sure that the number of issues that I'm dealing with, it's almost the same as like the 1, 2, 3 tiered system of theology I want to bring to politics as well, and say there are only a few things that I'm going to call evil. There are a lot of things that I think we can unpack and say are unwise and wrong, and this is a better way. And then there are a lot of things that we're going to disagree on. So, just want to, in answering this question, want to clarify our terms.
I think one of the things that makes a question like this kind of come to people's minds is the I don't know about uniqueness, but the unusualness of kind of where we're at as a nation. And what I mean by that is, in the New Testament, these were pagan nations with no Christian framework at all that the gospel came into. So you were immediately kind of separated from the reality of the national cultural realities that were going on. In America, that's a little different because we've come from a background where the cultural values in America were not, and biblical values were not that far apart in,
At least in some areas.
in years past, yeah. I think there's a much greater sense of feeling the change, that things are changing in various ways. And there's a drift towards what many people would say evil in certain ways. And I think we feel that. The New Testament just never kind of really deals with that issue. Find me in the Bible where it says you're to stand up for, something that's political or national, as a Christian and stand against that. It's just not there. Now, yes, you're to stand for biblical truth, and you're to be an influence and a representative of that truth in your life and your sphere of interactions. But I just don't see that call for the church, at least, to be standing against those kinds of things in the culture. Just doesn't seem to be there.
Yeah, and so that's so it's really hard to know the best way to apply in our own context, where again, as in a democracy, as citizens, we have a voice, and that gives us a responsibility to, so how exactly that intersects with what you see in the New Testament, basically just assuming that you're in a pagan culture, and as the church, you're distinctive, and live that out, and it's like, okay, well, how? And that's hard, and so I think that should at least give us some humility to say, because this is hard and difficult to see the best way forward, as believers, we might disagree on this. And that's one of those things, we've got to have charity of different conscience.
But I think it goes back to the church's role is to teach the biblical truth around these issues and to equip the saints and to send the saints out into the world to be salt and light and to make a difference in whatever ways God provides them opportunity to. I think that's kind of how we stand against those kinds of things in the world we live in.
Okay, so can you read the question again?
I can. Do you
don't
want the
mind?
whole thing, or do you want
Maybe like the first half.
before
of
the
it.
quote or after the quote? I'll break it up that
Yeah,
way.
go to Bonhoeffer and then stop there. Yeah.
Okay, so go before? Okay. All right. Do you think that one reason the church has not been more vocal in important issues that affect our culture and our children's future is because the bias of media has crept in? Could this be an intentional act of Satan to silence the church?
I think there's no doubt Satan's at work in our world. That's very clear. We talked about that before. But I also know that he's not going to thwart God's plans in that process. And the kingdom will go forth, and that plan will supersede Satan's plan in that process. And I think that one of the things they brought up in the quote was, or not in the quote, in the, can you read the rest of the question too? There's another part I
Do you
want
want
to
the
add.
quote or the second
Yeah.
half?
It's beyond the quote. I got the quote. Just read post
Okay.
quote.
What is going on in our country and world is evil. People are waking up to it. Why are some in the church so reluctant to address policies and laws that are in direct violation of
Yeah.
God's word?
So the reality is that us as pastors and as individuals in the church, we are all fallible people. God's word is the infallible, perfect thing. And so we want to speak where God's word speaks, as you said. And there's things that we'll do right, and there's things that we'll do wrong, and that's the mess of the church comes together to advance God's kingdom and God's purposes in that process. And there's no doubt, like I said, Satan's on the move. There's no doubt that we have God's plans even better than his plan. And so he'll work through all the little things. But I think that speaking where God speaks is what we're called to do, not to address every little political issue out there.
Yeah, and I think, and hopefully, maybe one of the things that could be illustrated by this conversation is, because I think part of the question is, like, there's a question of saying, like, are we drifting off of base and off mission because we're not speaking on these issues, and is that default of the liberal media or whatever? And hopefully, maybe one of the things you could gather from this conversation is that we are trying, at least, to be, as fallible people, we are trying to, as pastors, to think through and navigate through this storm in a way that keeps us locked on our gospel mission. I don't know how well we're doing at that. You can be the judge of that, but that's what we're trying. And so I would say to at least that part of the question is, no, I don't think that it's the bias of the media creeping in. We might have differences, maybe this question person and us, of how to navigate this, but we're trying our best to.
So you're not making the choices you're making as a team based off of aligning with a certain news source or political agenda or anything like that.
And
That's
even
not
and
where
even on the
this is coming
team,
from.
we're really politically across the spectrum on the team. We're saying, okay, the gospel is our North Star, and we're in this cultural storm. How do we keep that in focus? And we're gonna mess up in ways. We're gonna go this way and this way, but that's our desire. It's a gospel desire, not a political or media-driven thing.
And that's where, like we talked about end time stuff, we can hold politics in loose hands, being united with one another as brothers, because the gospel is the thing that goes forward, and that's the agenda that matters, not the political agenda.
Okay. All right. So I want to go back for something we talked about earlier. We asked the question for what is your source of information? How much time do you feel is warranted to be informed but not consumed? We have a follow-up to your answer on that. They want to know what is the answer to the source that you're recommending specifically. So what's the answer to the source?
So like, go to this news and that, not that news.
I'm assuming that's what this is in reference to.
Yeah, and so this, like Don was saying,
If that's not correct and it's you and you're still listening, text and let us know, because we will
if you have held out this long,
receive that. But I think
bless
that's
you.
what's happening.
Yeah,
I think part of it is we don't have all the right answers in terms of, like, I don't think it's necessarily fair to say, hey, like, this is the one news source. Mm-hmm. The reality is there's
the Bible.
The mess of the news sources out there. Like, it's helpful, like I said, for me to look at multiple different things. Other people, it's helpful to go to the local news source. There's not one perfect news source. I think some of the charts out there to kind of plot over, like, here's different news companies and here's how they lean. Mm-hmm. I think it's helpful so you can understand some of the things that where they lean and things like that. That can help you make informed decisions. But there's not one right news source at the end of the day.
Yeah, and so if I'm trying to give some real practical answer to that question as best as I can, other than Don's kind of suggestion of maybe local news is a good place to start. One practical suggestion I would give is be intentional about seeking out news sources and opinions outside of your own bias. So like, if you lean this direction and you're kind of generally getting sources here, be really intentional about, okay, I read this, now I'm going to go read this. Not even necessarily because the truth is somewhere in the middle, but I think that's just going to help keep us, if I can understand what the other side is thinking and feeling, how they're seeing that, that's just going to help me be a balanced person, a more informed person. So, yeah.
If you can do that with a genuineness of understanding, because what that can produce is, I knew those people were just...
Yeah, that's a good point. It's easier said than done.
So even that, one has to be cautious, because if you're on one side, then you're going to interpret the other side in probably a negative way. It's a tough challenge in the world we live in. It really is.
All right. I'm hoping whoever asked that's actually what you were trying to ask. If it's not, I apologize. We did our best.
It sounded like they were looking for the one
downfall of
pastorally
it being
authorized
anonymous.
news source, and we don't.
Yeah, I mean, we probably can't provide that, but this
House
is
News.
Sign up for the House News, gracecommunity.org. There you go. Eric, I'm surprised
That
you
is
didn't
a
make that plug.
reliable source of what's going on.
That'll work.
in the
Yeah.
That's all you need.
Since this is anonymous, if you come back with something and you want to tie it to something else, do text and let us know what you want us to tie it to, because that will help us make sure we accurately answer your question. Because I don't know, I'm done my best. So I'm sorry if that was not it. You know, send us an email. We'll answer it, I promise. All right, last question. Are we ready?
Yes.
As Christians, how do we walk the fine line of politically correctness, that's in air quotes, and issues on both sides of the aisle while still displaying the truth and love of Christ, while trying not to alienate those we are supposed to share the gospel with? One example, Black Lives Matter. Some say they're a Marxist organization, while others say, how can you not support Black Lives Matter? So let me know if I need to reread the question.
Really good question. Yeah, because I see, and cause maybe as the question continued, I was like, oh, they kind of answered what I was going to say. They kind of said what I was going to say. Maybe I'll say this, because I'm not sure what else to say. Even when it comes to a term like political correctness, I'd like to define terms to understand what we're talking about. Now, the question went on to kind of give some examples, because I think that there is a form of political correctness that requires you to compromise on truth, but there's also a form of political correctness that's, just like polite and caring and meeting someone where they're at. Like, if someone says that's an offensive term to call me, like, don't call him that. Like, it's like that's not complicated. But if someone says that, okay, you have to agree with this thing and say this, and like, then I might not be able to. So like, there are different kinds of levels of political correctness, and truth and love. I don't know if that's
In a
particularly
nutshell,
helpful.
the end.
Yeah, somebody else.
Well, no, I think that's good. But, I think we've gotten spoiled in this country as Christians, because we've lived a fairly harmonious life with the culture and the political system, etc. There is no guarantee that, that we're entitled to that. And I think as some of these things change, one of the things that seems to be changing is a growing hostility to a biblical worldview and the Christian faith, as it's expressed in a biblical kind of sound way. And we should probably face the reality that if we're going to live out being faithful Christians and even trying to interact with people in as loving a ways as we can, there's going to be some hostility towards that worldview and the way we would see and understand things. And it shouldn't surprise us if that's the case. And so, yeah, we're still to be those beatitude, gospel-centered, humble people in how we do that. But if you think that just doing that means that everybody's going to love you and think the best of you and agree with you, you're probably in for a sad awakening as time goes on here.
You think about the gospel, and you think about what Jesus said and some of the things Paul said. There's really two guarantees: that I will be with you, and that you're going to face persecution.
Yeah.
That's pretty clear throughout the New Testament. Those are things that we will face as believers. And one of my things I've kind of harped on with society is I think oftentimes Christians, I don't think, are immune from this, is that we think too simplistically. We think it's where it's all good or all bad. And the reality is we all have a mix of those good and bad. So think about political things like the Black Lives Matter. Oftentimes it can be very easy to think simplistically and say, okay, well, therefore because this organization has these ties, therefore everything it does is bad. It's like, okay, well, for the average white person, they're going to hear Black Lives Matter and tie all those things together. You speak to a lot of African-American folks, they separate very much the organization from the saying, and they're able to parse certain things there that as a society we don't typically always parse. And so being able to parse through those different pieces and say, all right, is there good things here I can learn from and grow from, and is there things that I would disagree with? And both those things can be true on anything in the political spectrum. And oftentimes we think of it too simplistically of all good or all bad. And it's just not the case. It's not how humans are wired. It's not how the world is wired. There's always a mix of those good things and bad things in our motives, in our heart, and everything.
Which is exactly what we were saying about politics.
Exactly.
You know, there's good, there's things we would affirm, there's things you know that are legitimate to do and be involved with, but there are some things that it can go wrong.
Yeah, and so so practically with what you're saying, I think that requires the recognition that there's a whole mix of good and bad here, and should prompt us in humility to say, I want to know where you're coming from, and using this phrase, and so can we be the kind of like driven by the gospel and to love enough to ask those kinds of questions, be humble enough to ask those kinds of questions, to not be afraid enough to enter into those kinds of conversations, to say, what do you mean when you say that? Like, do you support this? Do you support that? And to not be offended if someone asks me that, but to be thankful that we're having that kind of conversation. That's what we need more of.
Well, and they talked about the idea of affect their witness, I think. Is what
Yeah, they're talking about finding the right balance, I think, between truth and also not alienating those we're supposed to share the gospel with and be loving towards.
Yeah, so one of the things I'm a firm believer in is the reality that the gospel will cause offense to sin in our life. It's just the reality. But as believers, we don't necessarily want to add to the defense in that process. We want to be able to love and care for them. Even if we disagree with them, we want the thing that they're taking away is that, man, that person disagrees with me, but they love me.
Yeah, if we alienate people, let it be because of truth and the gospel and not because of us.
And not because, maybe even, I wonder if you'd agree with this, and also not because of secondary political things that can get in the way of the gospel.
Yeah, let's keep what's important.
All right. Well, any other comments on that final one?
I just want to say thank you for all the questions. That was awesome.
Yeah, really.
Be able to engage through those things. I know it
great.
took a little longer, but I mean, I'm so thankful that we're sitting here talking through very real issues and pointing them to the gospel and be able to discuss them really well and thoroughly. So I'm super thankful for people engaging in that and excited.
And those who've stuck with us the whole time.
Yeah, I know. If you're out there, thanks, you know.
And we're, I mean, you know, as a pastoral team, we're sorting through these things too. So it's not that we have the definitive answer on everything, but I think we're trying to walk a path, as Brendan said, that keeps our focus on our mission as the gospel, while figuring out how to navigate through these changes and things going on in the world around us and best serve the church in equipping them to do that. Are there more things we could say about those kinds of things? I'm sure there are. But that's why when things come up, like in the culture, we don't immediately respond because we want to talk them through as a pastoral team so we can make sure we're being as eminently biblical in how we approach those things, then we go and try to address them.
Yeah, we don't want to move at the speed of the news cycle. I don't think truth and wisdom moves at the speed of the news cycle.
Well, and I think that because our heart is that the primary diet from the up front is the gospel, that's why we want to be able to use resources like this, like different classes we're doing, to speak more in-depthly of some of these issues, because a Sunday morning less than an hour message, 45-minute message is not thorough enough to discuss a lot of these issues. We went here 2 hours, and we still have much more we could say.
Yeah.
And so as a church, being able to look at some of these resources, like the extra classes we're doing, like every summer we do 416 classes, like these Grace at the Table messages, great resources to dive in a more extensive way some of these very complicated issues we're facing in our world.
Yeah. And we are not shy to talk about them. So again, thank you guys for joining us, and thank you to everybody out there who sent in great questions. This is exactly what we always hope these times will be, that you guys would engage with us on this kind of a level on these topics.
Hopefully they're not all 2 hours long.
Yeah, and hopefully we don't always aim to go over. We apologize that this was a special 2-hour edition, but I think we wanted to make sure that if you guys ask questions, that you get them answered. That's important to us in these times. So thank you for doing that. Thank you guys for hanging in there. And next time,
Thanks, Katie.
we have a staff in here, so thanks to you guys. And next time, as Eric mentioned, we're going to be talking about love and practically how to love people in this culture, in today's world, amidst all the stuff that we just talked about
Yeah,
today
and like the
and more.
differing definitions of love and
Yes.
tolerance and accept, like how do we navigate that as gospel people? And yeah,
That's right.
it's good
So
stuff.
please come back next month and join us for that discussion, and thanks for your time.